great to have you here for another edition of our Human Security and Development Forum. This time on a very timely and important topic, the EU and South Korean strategies for the free and open Indo-Pacific. Of course, with the growing geopolitical and geo-economic significance of the Indo-Pacific, the European Union has been shifting its attention to the region. Several member states have published their strategies, but also the EU did. And the European Parliament has just recently adopted a report on the EU and security challenges in the Indo-Pacific. And I'm extremely happy that the rapporteur for this report and chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Mr. David McAllister, is here with us. But also, I'm very happy that we have Professor Lim Jong from South Korea, because South Korea does not have overarching strategy for the Indo-Pacific, but it is, in fact, one of the key like-minded partners in the region. And of course, Indo-Pacific is a region not just with immense opportunities for cooperation, but it's also, unfortunately, a region with growing tensions. So we will look both at the positive and, let's say, a bit more controversial developments. Before I introduce everyone else, just a few words about me. So my name is Dr. Teresa Novotná, and I'm a research fellow here at the Korea Europe Center, but also senior associate at the Europeum, our organizer, as well as Korea associate at 9-1. We have, well, 3 people in the room and 2 guests online. If you allow me, I will continue with the ladies. So I would like to continue with introducing Professor Lim Jong, who is Associate Professor at Gwangju National University. She also serves there as Vice President and the Dean of the Institute of Korean Education and Culture and of International Language Education. She specializes in international cooperation in the Indo-Pacific, so she's the best person to have here. She also works on other topics. She has degrees from University of Tokyo, Columbia, and PhD from Johns Hopkins University, so wide-ranging experience, and if I may say, very much a rising star of Korean academia and policy world. So welcome here. Here I have also my dear colleague from France, Antoine Bondas. Welcome, especially since you came over. Antoine is a research fellow and director both of the Korea and Taiwan programs at Fondation pour la Recherche Stratégique, FRS, in France, in Paris. He focuses on China, Taiwan, Korea, and has been involved in lots of policy events and activities. And I think we met for the first time in 2017 during Korea Next Generation Expert Network in Seoul. So in a way, Seoul is bringing us always together, or the other side of the Korean Peninsula to maybe point out. Then I have also my colleague from here, from the Institute, Florian Koking, who will serve as moderator for the second half of this event, because I will then sort of switch from being a moderator to being a participant. Florian kind of agreed to take over the moderating of the second part, and he's also an expert on South Korea, both history and current affairs, but also he's a trained sinologist. Last but certainly not very least, our great honor is to welcome here Mr. David McAllister, chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the European Parliament, where he served since 2014. And as I already mentioned, he's the rapporteur for the EU's report on security challenges in the Indo-Pacific, which I believe basically sailed through the Parliament with overwhelming vote in favor. And I'm sure Mr. McAllister will tell us more about the report. But here for audience in Germany, Mr. McAllister is also very well known as a Prime Minister of Niedersachsen or Lower Saxony in 2010 and 13, and also a member of the Land Parliament. He represents CDU, or as I should say, rather at the European level, the EPP or European People's Party, and I believe he's a chair of that party. So without much further ado, Mr. McAllister, please, the virtual floor is yours. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning from Brussels, and thank you, Ms. Novotná, for your kind words of introduction. I'm pleased to join you here from the European Parliament. You can imagine today is a very busy day in Brussels because today and tomorrow historic decisions will probably be taken by the 27 heads of government by granting EU candidate status to Ukraine and to the Republic of Moldova, and also granting candidate status to Georgia, but only once a number of important conditions have been met in Tbilisi. And apart from the three Eastern countries very high on our agenda, the 6 Western Balkan heads of government are also in town, and they are just now meeting the 27 heads of government. But now we want to talk about Indo-Pacific and what this all means for us in the European Union and also for other parts of the world. And I would especially like to welcome our guests who are connected from Seoul. You mentioned our last trip of the Foreign Affairs Committee to the region took us to Indonesia and Thailand. And the one before, we went to Japan and South Korea. And it was just an amazing visit. And I'll praise the Republic of Korea at the end of my short introductory remarks. 4 points I want to make. The first one is the values and the basic direction of EU policies. Our interest as European Union in the Indo-Pacific is founded in the wish to develop our societies further in an open, democratic, and just direction, while allowing other countries and societies to possibly do the same. So in addition to the democratic framework, we are guided by the principles of openness and transparency. The European Union is well known to be a staunch defender of multilateralism and a rules-based international order. We want to work together with like-minded partners to promote democracy and the human rights. Through our foreign policy, we project our core values, human rights, fundamental freedoms, gender equality, democracy, and the rule of law. And I strongly believe that this is a powerful and transformative tool. Coherence, the rule of law, reconciliation, and solidarity are the foundations. And what undermines this? Fragmentation, unilateralism, and democratic backsliding. So the first point is that, of course, the European Union has its own interests, and we want to defend our interests. We want to promote our interests, but our foreign policy is always value-driven, and the values we try to promote are the fundamental values of Article 2 of the EU Treaty. The Indo-Pacific, and this is my second remark, has finally entered the agenda of the European Union's foreign policy. It took us quite a while, and I'm happy that after our member states, France, Germany, and the Netherlands presented their own Indo-Pacific strategies, the EU followed suit last year. Why are we so interested in the Indo-Pacific? Well, for obvious reasons. First of all, the Indo-Pacific is challenged by a new global context, especially since the beginning of the war of aggression of the Russian Federation against Ukraine, just as we are. This is also affecting regional stability in this part of the world. The European Union wants to help to reinforce the rules-based international order. The real power of the European Union is our economic power. We can do this as the top investor. We can do this as the leading development cooperation partner, and also as one of the biggest trading partners in the entire Indo-Pacific. If you look at the Indo-Pacific and Europe and count the numbers together, we hold 70% of global trade in goods and services, as well as over 60% of foreign direct investment flows. This region has become the center of geopolitical competition. This region is a new rallying point for major global players, with the United States and China at the center of an increasing rivalry. But we in Europe know that current dynamics in the region do not only affect regional stability, but in the end also the prosperity and the security of the EU. In addition to contributing to the security and stability in the region, we hope to boost trade and investment, economic openness, and a sustainable approach to connectivity. For connectivity, we build on the new EU Global Gateway Initiative. The Indo-Pacific region is very complex and it's very diverse, but what we have certainly identified is that we have some real partners and like-minded countries in the region. Let me name South Korea, Japan, India, Australia, New Zealand, or the United States. So here are cooperation partners, like-minded partners. The European Union wants to cooperate within or closer emerging security structures such as Quad and AUKUS. We want to support the centrality of ASEAN, and this is key for us. We want to promote maritime security and freedom of navigation in full compliance with international law. Ms. Novotná, you already mentioned the European Parliament adopted a resolution a couple of weeks ago on the 7th of June, reflecting specifically how the European Union should protect our interests and work more closely with our partners in the Indo-Pacific. This resolution was carried with a broad majority, and I was happy to carry it through the Parliament as rapporteur. The European Parliament, across party lines, underlines the critical importance of preserving peace, stability, and the freedom of navigation in this region, a region of growing economic and geopolitical significance. We stress that this region is home to 60% of the world's population and 7 G20 members. This region is a key global actor and home to, as I just mentioned, increasingly important political, trade, and security partners for us in the EU. We welcome that the High Representative and Vice President of the Commission, Josep Borrell, finally presented and then the member states adopted the new EU strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. As Parliament, we call on the EU to pursue fruitful bilateral relations with partners and countries in the region, such as ASEAN or the African Indo-Pacific countries. We as an EU believe that we should work closely with other liberal democracies and historical allies in the region, and we believe that we could fully exploit our position and reputation as a credible global actor for peace amid the growing geopolitical competition between global and regional powers in the region. My third remark is the impact of the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine. This war is having a profound and lasting impact on international relations. And as a result, the European Union must further consolidate its international engagements, in particular in the Indo-Pacific. While we welcome that 14 countries in the Indo-Pacific not only voted in favor, but also co-sponsored the United Nations General Assembly resolution condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we also have to acknowledge that 10 countries in the region abstained. As Parliament, we are concerned that China has not condemned the illegal war in Ukraine. We continue to call on the Chinese leadership to use its close contacts with the Russian president to urge him to immediately stop this violent war and remove all troops from Ukrainian territory. The European Union needs to increase its joint efforts in capability development, especially in the maritime field, in order to be a credible security actor in the region. That's why, as Parliament, we support the European plans to intensify our dialogues with regional partners on security and defense, including counterterrorism, cybersecurity, non-proliferation, disarmament, hybrid threats, and maritime security. What leaders here in Brussels will be discussing today and tomorrow is also that Russia is using food as a weapon of war, stealing grain, blockading ports, and turning farmlands into battlefields. There are over 20 million tons of grain, wheat, and corn stuck in Ukraine just now. This is disrupting global food security, driving up prices, causing a global famine. Global hunger is everyone's business, so this is also where the EU and the Indo-Pacific can work together. A coordinated, comprehensive, and global approach is needed. And a fourth remark, I'm looking now at Yen Yong-lim, Korea. I just want to tell you that we were so delighted returning in April 2018 from Japan and South Korea's Foreign Affairs Committee. We believe that this was an extremely interesting trip, well organized by Ambassador Reiter at that time in Seoul, because it also helped him to strengthen our bilateral strategic partnership. Since then, we have welcomed South Korean delegations from the National Assembly in the European Parliament. Our discussions focused on the free trade agreement, on climate change, security, and technology. And during the pandemic, we also had online formats. If I say that the European Union has like-minded partners outside Europe, We especially think of the Republic of Korea. We share similar values and interests. We have agreements covering political relations and sectoral cooperation, free trade and crisis management cooperation. These agreements all enable frequent high-level exchanges and concrete cooperation. I would also like to really wholeheartedly welcome the Korean government's strong condemnation of Russia's aggression against Ukraine, and also the immediate decision in Seoul to actively join the international community's efforts and response, including all the economic sanctions. We as a European Union, we support a diplomatic solution to the Korean nuclear crisis. The South Korean government seeks to maintain peace on the Korean peninsula by encouraging inter-Korean and also US-North Korea dialogue. The European Union will always stand alongside our South Korean partners and friends. We support all international diplomatic and counter-proliferation efforts, and we will continue to work closely together with our friends and partners in Seoul on addressing DPRK nuclear and ballistic challenges. In support of the United Nations Security Council resolutions, the EU has, of course, adopted a series of sanctions. So despite cultural differences and despite the geographic distance that sets us apart, we in Korea and in Europe share so many joint values, and also the commitment to democracy, human rights, the rule of law, and the market economy. And as a German citizen, I fully understand that one day, hopefully, Korea can enjoy the same, what we were allowed to enjoy in Germany. When in 1989 the wall fell, in the 1990 we had the possibility of celebrating German reunification, which will mark the 31st anniversary this year. So to sum up my main messages in a few words, let me say the following. The Indo-Pacific is the world's largest and most populous region with increasing political, economic, and geostrategic importance. A peaceful, a stable, a rules-based Indo-Pacific is also in our vital European interest. We now have a strategy, and now we need to implement our strategy. But I believe that this strategy on cooperation in the Indo-Pacific will give us a number of opportunities to strengthen our engagement with the region in a pragmatic, flexible, and inclusive manner. I'll keep it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. McAllister, for highlighting the positive aspects and why the Pacific is important, but also touching on the challenges in broader terms, but also the specific ones which we are all facing now. Maybe because we can always talk about and also of course thank you for bringing the importance of South Korea and the Korean Peninsula. Perhaps now we'll take first a few questions directed to you and to your work in the European Parliament and to the EU's position on the Indo-Pacific before we have a bit broader discussion. So maybe before everyone sort of reflects on what to ask, perhaps I will make use of my role as a moderator for this part and ask you some questions. And of course, I think I should start with the most topical issue and possibly the most difficult one, which everyone is facing these days, and that's repercussions of the Russian invasion of Ukraine for the Indo-Pacific. I mean, you mentioned your appreciation of the support of the countries throughout the Indo-Pacific, as well as noted those who abstained from the vote at the UN. But perhaps in general, my feeling is that within the Indo-Pacific, apart from China, we have some countries which sort of insist on their neutrality in the conflict and sort of insist on the fact that, it's our European business. Don't bring us into it. Of course, India would probably be sort of the largest country which has this stance, and in fact, India is probably even that country which, at one point was trying to circumvent the sanctions. In ASEAN, we have Singapore, which is quite strongly supportive, but then everyone else seems to be, perhaps condemning publicly, but rather, not doing much in terms of standing up. And then, you mentioned Korea, and you appreciated South Korea as the country which joined the international sanctions and the condemnation, but at the same time, Korean government has been criticized for not really, making its own sanctions, not really responding positively to Ukraine's request for different weapon deliveries. But at the same time, we will have President Yoon coming to Europe basically next week. Who he has been invited to join the NATO summit in Madrid. So in a way, my question is, how do we deal with this range of views in the Indo-Pacific, and how do we bring as many countries on board as possible?
Well, thank you for this question. Of course, the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine is the most pressing issue in the European Union for obvious reasons at the moment. I think everyone who's dealing with foreign affairs will either have virtually in this pocket of his jacket or a handbag, or perhaps even in writing, who voted which way at the United Nations General Assembly, a vote. 141 countries described and voted for what this war actually is. It's simply a blatant violation of international. It's a totally unjustified, illegal war of aggression, full stop. 4 countries voted with the Russian Federation: Syria, North Korea, Eritrea, and Belarus. I think these 4 countries just say everything. If you only have these 4 friends left, you've obviously done something wrong in life, I would always tell the Russian dictator. But if you look at the countries who abstained, there were some where we didn't expect much else: China, Iran, Cuba, Venezuela. But there were other countries where we were rather surprised that they abstained, countries like India or South Africa, because you can have closer relations to Russia than others, and you can closer connected to Moscow than others. But on such a fundamental question that one country invades another country without any kind of justification, I just simply find it difficult to be neutral, because you cannot be neutral on that. And of course, when I speak to visitors here in Brussels, and if I travel abroad, speaking to people in Latin America, in Africa, or also in Asia and the entire Indo-Pacific, they say, well, this war is none of our business. It's a European war. And I can only tell them, well, yes, this is a war in the middle of Europe, but this is more than the largest country in Europe, Russia, invading the second largest country by size, Ukraine. This is a fundamental attack on the European peace and security architecture we have jointly built up since 1945, which even held during the coldest days, weeks, and months of the Cold War. And everything has been put into question by the Russian dictator, by the regime in the Kremlin. And that's why this is so serious. This is not only an internal European war. This questions the whole European and global peace and security architecture. And the dictator of the Kremlin and his kleptocratic criminal entourage, they obviously have this idea that you can divide the world into spheres of influence, like we did in the 19th century. This is totally bizarre. And obviously, the Russian dictator believes that everything which belonged to the Russian Empire until 1917, or what was part of the so-called Soviet Union until 1990, is kind of his. And that makes it really, really dangerous, because if the Russians succeed in Ukraine, their appetite will grow. And then other countries will be on their list: Moldova, Georgia, just to name 2. And don't forget that we have former members of the Soviet Union who are now our proud and loyal EU partners and NATO allies. So this goes way beyond Europe. And then another point: why are the Indo-Pacific countries also involved directly? Well, the rising prices of grain, energy, and fertilizers have an immediate result of the ongoing war of aggression. And a final point: China is very carefully observing how the international community, and especially we in the so-called West, the European Union, the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, but also our partners In the other part of the world, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand are reacting to the Russian war of aggression. And that's why we have to be very firm in our stance towards the Russian Federation. And I can only once again say, and I'm very passionate about this, we should give Ukraine maximum support and we should put maximum pressure on the Russian Federation without getting directly involved in this war.
Yes, yes. Thank you very much for this statement. Before in your remarks, I encourage everyone to ask questions, so please make the use of that opportunity. In your remarks, you also mentioned question of food security as sort of one of the difficult problems to be tackled. And it's not, of course, just the fact of possibly upcoming hunger, but also the way how it is portrayed. I think High Representative Borrell talks about a battle of narratives, right? And especially in Africa, I think we can see that sort of the way how Russia portrays it as a result of European sanctions is taking hold. But this is also something which possibly can be replicated in Asia, because also some of the Asian countries are dependent on the supplies from Ukraine, possibly Russia. So how do you also see this aspect in the Indo-Pacific, how this could be even possibly prevented from happening? And in general, what do you think are the sort of the lessons for the Indo-Pacific from what has been going on in Europe? I've just been recently to a conference with a very catchy title, "Is War Over Taiwan Coming?" Would you relate it to that aspect as well? So, in a way, what are the lessons also for the Indo-Pacific, and also the question of different narratives in the region? Thank you.
First of all, let me pay respect to the incredibly brave women and men in Ukraine who are defending their home country and their liberty. As somebody who served 2 years in the German military myself, I can only say that I absolutely admire the Ukrainian armed forces, how they are dealing with fighting a military superpower, what the Russian Federation undoubtedly is. And whatever we can do to support Ukraine with ammunition, with guns, with artillery, with tanks, with rocket launchers, whatever we should do, because once again, these people are not only defending their own country and their own liberty, they are defending European values and, in the end, the future of the European peace and security architecture. The military war is still ongoing, and we don't know how long it will take. It could take a long, long time. But the Russians have mainly lost the propaganda war. This whole nonsense the Kremlin was trying to spread about Russia defending itself against a violent attack of alleged fascists in Ukraine. I mean, nobody bought this nonsense, perhaps apart from a few supporters left in North Korea and Belarus. So the propaganda war the Russians have lost, at least the first round. But of course, we have to now make clear that the problems we are facing with the shortage in food supplies, the rising prices for grain, energy, and fertilizers, all this is indeed a result of the war. But the war was started by the Russian Federation, by nobody else, full stop. And that's why it was very important that the High Representative, Josep Borrell, now reached out to all his counterparts, the foreign ministers in Africa, explaining why we are in this situation and that they should not believe the Russian propaganda that the problems are a result of the sanctions. It's not about the sanctions. It's about the problem is that Russia is blockading food exports from Ukrainian ports. It is Russia that is responsible for destroying farmland in Ukraine. It is Russia that is destroying agricultural equipment in Ukraine and so on. The situation is very serious. That's why there are many efforts in Europe trying to make possible that we create kind of green agricultural lanes, that we get the produced wheat from Ukraine out of the country, which is, of course, very difficult if shipping is hardly possible in the Black Sea, and you won't be able to do everything by rail and lorry. However, all efforts here, we are ready to support. And apart from that, we have to step up our agricultural production all over the world, including in Europe. We are in a devastating situation. We are in the middle of a war, and this war might create the biggest humanitarian hunger crisis we have seen for many years and decades. That's why we are all in this together. That's why we also call on all other parties involved. Now, we all together have to step up our food production to provide as much as possible to countries, especially in the Middle East and Northern Africa, who will be hit hard. And the best thing, of course, would be that this war ends, and that this war ends is and remains in the hands of the Kremlin, and especially the dictator, Vladimir Putin. We call on Mr. Putin, respect international law, get involved in mediation efforts, withdraw your troops, your tanks, your fighter planes from Ukrainian territory, and then we can talk about peace negotiations. But these are the preconditions. So that's really where we are in the moment. Final point, we will need very, very close international cooperation here to deal with this upcoming hunger crisis. And this will include also close cooperation with big agricultural producers like Australia, like India, like the United States or the Latin American countries, just to name a few.
Yes, yes. I hope that in the next multilateral meetings will move in this direction. Maybe I'll ask a specific question for you before we open to debate. Let's not be pessimistic about developments and look at more about at the positive side of things. At the end of your remarks, you said that now we have all the strategies, including the European one, and now we need to implement them. Before that, you also spoke about good cooperation with Korea and other like-minded partners in the Indo-Pacific. So, what would be your ways how to implement the EU strategy or even your European Parliament's report, and especially how to work with the partners in the region?
I think the European Union is world champion in writing, discussing, and then adopting strategies. I have the feeling that we seem to have a strategy nearly on every issue around the world, and how to deal with the nearly 200 countries in the world, especially the more than 170 countries who are not in the European Union. In general, I would say that a lot of paper has been printed, a lot of strategies have been adopted, and we now really need to focus on implementation. The European Union's foreign policy had a lack of strategies, definitely. And a major step forward was in 2016, the global strategy presented then by the High Representative and Vice President Federica Mogherini. That was a major step forward. The problem of the global strategy was that it didn't carry the signatures of the 27, or at that time 28 heads of state and government. That is the major difference to the strategic compass, which was adopted in March in Versailles. It has the 27 signatures of the heads of state and government. Why am I saying this? Because I have called in the European Parliament during a debate once in our committee that I would suggest a moratorium for further strategies. We have them all now. We have the strategic compass, which is the most important strategy for us how to move on towards a fully fledged European Defence Union. We will in June have the updated NATO strategy adopted at the NATO summit in Madrid. And then we need to put the keys together, the lines together, the knots between the EU and the NATO strategy for a third EU-NATO declaration. And then we have clearly formulated strategies for certain parts of the world, including the Indo-Pacific strategy. The Indo-Pacific strategy, that's why I welcome this, made clear that engagement in the Indo-Pacific is not only something for France, which, by the way, is an Indo-Pacific nation too, through the French overseas presence, It is not only an issue for Germany and the Netherlands, but to other countries who have their own Indo-Pacific strategies, because these two countries are very, very reliant on free and open maritime traffic and safe maritime traffic. But this is an issue of all 27. And Ms. Novotná, I guess that you will have some kind of Czech background or Slovak, I'm not sure. The Czech presidency of the European Union announced that they will make the Indo-Pacific one of their foreign policy priorities in the upcoming Czech presidency. And that is good, that a landlocked country like the Czech Republic also has identified what happens in the Indo-Pacific is so important that it has immediate effect on all of us in Europe. It doesn't matter if we have a coastline or not. So the Indo-Pacific strategy of the European Union is a good one. Let's try and make as much as that possible. In the end, as always in foreign policy, action speaks, not words. We should focus especially on the security dimension, on the maritime traffic, connectivity, the Global Gateway Initiative, and finally also all our other related activities, how we can strengthen democracy, the rule of law, and the defense of human rights in the region. And here our first and most important partners are, of course, the countries I mentioned, countries who are very similar to the European Union, the way they think about multilateralism and the rules-based international order. And the final point, our Indo-Pacific strategy is inclusive. We are open for cooperation. Our strategy is not against certain countries and against a very specific country, starting with C, which of course plays a very important role in your part of the world. But on China, we have to be very clear that China, on the one hand, remains for us a cooperation partner. China is an economic competitor. For us, important is that we have a free and fair competition, a level playing field. And in the moment, this doesn't exist. But we also have to be very clear that the communist leadership in China has very different views than we do as regards human rights, international law, liberties, freedom, and democracy. And we are extremely concerned in Europe about China's rapid military buildup in the region. And we call on China to respect international law and to respect the territorial integrity and sovereignty, including their sea areas of all neighbors and partners in the region. So I think that we have a lot to do in the next few years, and I very much welcome that. It took the European Union a few years' time to identify how important the Indo-Pacific is, but now we're here. And Ms. Novotná, wouldn't you agree that once the European Union has adopted a strategy, there's nothing else that we can do than finally implement it? Thank you.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much. Those are really good words. And of course, thank you for bringing up my homeland, Czech Republic, which indeed is still having Indo-Pacific among its priorities, despite the current situation, which sort of pushed it down a little bit down the agenda, but it's still there. So that's great. I think now we can switch a little bit to the roundtable discussion. Of course, I'm still quite happy if you have any questions. You can still send them through the chat. But I will leave it up to Florian to take over, and I'll become sort of roundtable participant. So thank you very much, Florian.
No, thank you very much, Teresa, and thank you very much, Mr. McAllister, for participating. And I would just do what you suggested and ask Professor Yoon and ask Antoine if, maybe in this order, if you have comments or questions on what David McAllister presented on the EU strategy for the Indo-Pacific.
Again, thank you for having me. I can't thank enough. Let me just express really my deep gratitude to the Institute for Korea Studies at Free University Berlin. Again, and I truly enjoyed reading the report again, to Mr. McAllister, and I truly enjoyed your remarks as well. I do see many, complementarities between Europe and South Korea. Again, you highlight these 3 points. Regarding all the 3 points, I think now today's Korea has common interest with the Europe. And not only myself, I do think of many other policymakers or policy experts, academic, the scholar. They do feel like, again, the Europe is now really increasingly more and more important for the South Korea as well. So the thing is, even though we share, of course, the value, and we want to keep supporting the Ukraine, and absolutely, we do have a common interest surrounding the maritime security in this region, Indo-Pacific, because if you think about the South Korea's location, this is also disconnected. This country is also disconnected from the continent. So it's island-like, even though it's still part of the continent, but, it's an island-like country. So we definitely need to keep the maritime security as well. So we have many common interests, but the thing is, again, the North Korea, I'm sorry, just keep bringing in, again, the North Korean issues. But as long as North Korea's that nuclear and missile threats are there, our, whatever those global approach or more value-oriented approach can be just, how would you say, held back by all this, conventional concerns. Of course, the human rights over there, that's another like a concern. Climate crisis, is serious in this region as well. And North Korea's food security, all this, after natural disaster masses are another like a challenge to their society as well. So we want to help them. But again, as long as the conventional threats are still there, it's really difficult to move on. So my question is, again, to the Mr. McAllister, how would you like to suggest for the future Europe and South Korea partnership to solve this conventional threat problem, again, in the peninsula, mostly caused by the North Korea? So again, that will be my question to the Mr. McAllister.
Mm-hmm. Would you like to directly answer?
I have learned something. Never discuss DPRK-related issues with people from the Republic of Korea, because you know a million times more, and you have to deal with this extremely difficult neighbor in the north. I think it's fair to say that the European Union has shown a lot of solidarity with the Republic of Korea. We support a peaceful and diplomatic resolution with the DPRK, but of course only if the specific interests and concerns of our partner country, Korea, are covered. So we are conducting this policy in close coordination with our international partners. The EU27 have been very outspoken in strongly condemning the DPRK's ballistic missile and nuclear tests and all the other nuclear proliferation-related activities. We have urged, and we will continue to urge, the DPRK to finally sign and ratify the CTBT, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, and return to compliance with all the treaties on non-proliferation of nuclear weapons and with the International Atomic Energy Agency. We have also, as I mentioned, adopted sanctions against the DPRK, and I believe that we have to continue our policy of pressure on the DPRK. We need to isolate the DPRK, and we call on the dictator in North Korea to follow the proposals I just made. So here we are alongside with our partners, and that's what the partnership is all about. It's not only about warm words, but it's also about showing solidarity. And just like the South Koreans have shown such remarkable solidarity with us in Europe because of this dreadful war which is ongoing in the heart of Europe, we, on the other hand, also will show our solidarity with our friends in South Korea.
Thank you very much, Mr. Makas, for your very interesting presentation. I will be very brief because I know that you have to go. So I will have maybe three very, very brief questions. The first one is, do you have an intention to kind of set up more inter-parliamentary discussion with countries in the Indo-Pacific? We've seen in February this year the Europe Indo-Pacific ministerial meeting in Paris with ministers of foreign affairs from 50 countries gathering in Paris. Do you have any intention at the parliaments level to have these kind of exchanges with parliaments from the Indo-Pacific, and maybe to set up, why not, an ad hoc group? Could be of course a short one, but between European parliaments and Indo-Pacific parliaments. The second one would be, we've had a lot of announcements over the last few months in terms of EU policy toward the Indo-Pacific, but we do not have kind of an agenda and a timeline. And do you expect the External Action Service to provide the Parliament with a timeline, an expected timeline of the many initiatives that have been announced in the region? And last, that's linked actually with the former questions, we've had over the last few months many initiatives in the Indo-Pacific. Many of those already existed, actually, even before we agreed on the strategy. But it seems that we do not have initiatives for the Indo-Pacific. It's mostly initiative in the Indo-Pacific. So we don't have, I would say, even one broad initiative that would cover the whole diversity of the region. Could be, as you mentioned, something related to maritime security, to maritime issues. But we fail, I would say, to have one key initiative for the Indo-Pacific. Do you have any idea about what could be that initiative? Not in the Pacific, once again, we have plenty, but for the Indo-Pacific. Thank you very much.
All excellent questions. If I have to rush away in a moment, it's because the President of the Republic of Zambia, Hakainde Hichilema, will be addressing the European Parliament in a moment, and I will have to sit on my seat as chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, because we're also inviting presidents from African countries to discuss the issues we were just discussing, also about the Russian propaganda and how they're trying to give us and the West the blame now for the expected food supply shortages. In short, I mean, there are so many initiatives the European Union has announced with our partners in the Indo-Pacific, also for the Indo-Pacific and with the Indo-Pacific. I could mention the joint dialogue on cybersecurity between EU and Indo-Pacific countries. But I would say, perhaps because I'm a foreign policy and security and defense man, the one which I found remarkable, which is an initiative of the EU in a part of the Indo-Pacific, but it's for the Indo-Pacific, is actually the UNAVFOR Atalanta, where you have a remarkable presence of an EU military mission, and that EU NAVFOR has undertaken joint exercises with countries like Japan, the Republic of Korea, but also countries you might not expect immediately, Vietnam, Oman, Djibouti, or India, where we want to make clear that UNAVFOR for us plays an important role in naval diplomacy, and hopefully we can provide a strong contribution to maritime security in the Indian Ocean. By the way, also in particular, by successfully protecting vessels of the World Fruit Program we were already discussing, and by curbing piracy at the coastline of Somalia. So what we have seen is that we are present in the region through France, the only Indo-Pacific member of the European Union. We have seen military presence through the Netherlands and Germany. Of course, sending a frigate to this part of the world doesn't have a major impact on the military situation But it was highly symbolic that European nations say, hey, what's going on in this part of the world is important, and we want a free, open, and stable Indo-Pacific. And a final point on parliamentary cooperation. The difference is between Europe and the European Union and the Indo-Pacific, that isn't an existing framework of Indo-Pacific nations. What we have seen is that where the European Union has closer contacts with partners, there's also a parliamentary dimension to it. We have an European Parliament, South Korean parliamentary cooperation through the delegation. We have the same cooperation with our Japanese counterparts, or with the parliaments of New Zealand and Australia, or with the Indian Parliament. But where one field is certainly missing is that the EU-ASEAN cooperation in the short, or at least in the midterm, should also get a kind of a parliamentary dimension. So we in the European Parliament are open for establishing EU-ASEAN Parliamentary Assembly cooperation, because it is rather astonishing that we have a parliamentary dimension of our cooperation with the Latin American countries. There's a parliamentary dimension to the cooperation between the European Union and the African Union, between the European Parliament and the Pan-African Parliament, but there's nothing similar with the ASEAN countries. The next EU-ASEAN summit will be in December this year, and I am planning to also put EU-ASEAN relations, and especially the question of parliamentary cooperation, on the agenda of the Foreign Affairs Committee ahead of the next EU-ASEAN summit. And a final point, we are very much focused in Europe always on China and India as the two big giants in the Indo-Pacific. We're very much focused on our traditional like-minded partners and allies, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand. But we should always never underestimate the important role Indonesia is playing in the region, not only as an individual country, as the fourth largest country in the world, the third largest democracy in the world, but also as the lead country of the community they call ASEAN. So I'll keep it there. Thank you so much for your interest. If you have any input for our parliamentary work on the Indo-Pacific, please send me an email, and I will now rush to the Parliament's plenary to welcome the President of Zambia.
Well,
Thank you very much.
yes, thank you very much. If I may, on behalf of everyone, thank you. Of course, we don't want to keep you for welcoming the Zambian president. So thank you very much for your frank and open discussion, and hope to see you next time again, maybe in person. So
Thank you. Ahoy, Mr.
thank
Vogt.
you.
So thank you very much for all your reacts and comments to Professor Nagelis. And I would like to start our more intimate discussion, so to say, with refocusing now on South Korea, because we have talked much about the EU Indo-Pacific strategy, but not so much about what Korea actually is doing at the moment. And just to start our conversation, I would like my first question to address Professor Lim. Well, we had now a presidential change in South Korea. And just generally, I would like to ask you if you already can see any changes in South Korean policy and strategy towards the Indo-Pacific.
Sure. Again, as you already watched, this specific presidential election was, how would you say, pretty much different from any presidential election in many ways. Of course, I can probably spend another hours to talk about it, but my quick point is the margin was the thinnest ever, the closest ever in the history, which means this whole society is literally divided. It was pretty much reminiscent of, for example, 2016 Hillary versus Trump election, or some other will say it was reminiscent of the Trump-Biden election. But whatever you just compare, The point is, it was very polarized situation. Having said that, even though the Yoon Suk-yeol administration, before actually he won the presidential election, he, as you probably know, he wrote an article and published it through the Foreign Affairs magazine, and he highlighted he highlighted that the Korea's foreign policy need to be beyond the peninsula, and he raised the slogan, so-called the global pivotal state, which is pretty much corresponding, I think, to these days the recast from some other countries like Europe or other, again, the like-minded countries. So in that sense, I personally do support the idea, and I think many of us support that idea. But again, at the same time, we do see strong opposition too. So for example, Russian-Ukraine war too, when the Russia invaded, it was in the middle of the presidential campaign period. And the other candidate, actually, he said, like, that's not actually that much related to our issues. So which was probably pretty shocking to me too, because how can he, to say that, this war is not that relevant to our security issue. I can agree more with the Mr. McAllister's that remark, this specific war was not just about the between the two countries. It is much more than that. So it triggered, of course, all the security surrounding the controversies here in these countries as well. But what I'm trying to say is, even though we are now trying to move our gears and aiming for global pivotal state, that's one big group, of course, support that idea. But at the same time, we do see pretty strong opposition too. So that's, again, to be honest, that's the situations. But I will say, I'd love to support the idea. Again, South Korea cannot be just stuck in this region, stuck in this issue. I do also think South Korea needs to do more and has more responsibility with many other global affairs. Yeah. Did I answer that question?
Yes.
Sorry, I was a little.
Yeah. It was just when we are used in South Korean politics, especially in terms of foreign policy, to always have new initiatives with the incumbent president. And one of the big questions we have is that if one initiative from President Moon Jae-in was quite successful, even though it was not very mediatized in Europe, was actually the New Southern Policy, and then the New Southern Policy Plus that was adopted in 2020. And one of the key questions we have is, the New Southern Policy is the de facto Indo-Pacific strategy, focusing, of course, a lot on Southeast Asia as well as in India, even though it's maybe less successful with India. But it is, I would say, a strong foundation for an Indo-Pacific strategy. And it's also quite interesting because the same way the Europeans are not willing to get stuck between the US and China, the same way we don't want to label our Indo-Pacific through the Sino-US competition. This is exactly what Korea does. And that's why actually we can connect and converse easily. From the Australian perspective, even from the Japanese perspective, it's very different. And the willingness of the Europeans and the Koreans not to address the China or China-US issue directly through the Indo-Pacific strategy is a good way for us to converge. And one of the key questions we have now is, we do a lot in terms of bilateral cooperation. We are negotiating the digital partnership, the green partnership, etc. The key question is, what can we do together now in third countries? And how do we identify between Brussels and Seoul a real cooperation in third countries? Should it be in terms of economic security? Should it be in terms of environmental security? But there is a lot we can do. And so far, we don't see that many common initiatives, joint initiatives in third countries. We do a lot together, but we don't do a lot together abroad. And that's something we should work on. Because once again, when we have a dialogue to say that cyber is important, digital, we often say it. But what do we do together in the country? Should it be development aid related to environmental issues? Should it be more having more resilient supply chain? And just to conclude, if there is one item now that has been discussed between Europe and Korea, but is much more huge now than before, that the concept even of economic security. So I think in that you can include energy security, the resilience of supply chain, etc., facing economic coercion, etc. But we know that the present office, we should not call it like Chungwa anymore, but we have the present office specific post for economic security, an advisor for economic security was appointed. It would be very interesting actually for that new appointment to discuss with the Europeans how do we define economic security and how do we converge.
I would like to pick up on a point that you made, that actually the Moon Jae-in administration had some sort of Indo-Pacific policy, which is New Southern Policy N+. However, it seemed that the South and Southeast Asian nations were more reluctant to cooperate with Korea in terms of security, like traditional security issues. Would you think, Professor Lim and Teresa, that this may change now with Korea's more direct approach to be an active participant or actor in security in Southeast Asia?
Okay. Again, the Moon Jae-in administration, they provided both directions. Again, the north toward the north and toward the south. The so-called the South policy, of course, the center was ASEAN, the cooperation with ASEAN. And as I mentioned, if you think about the delivery, for example, oil, petroleum from Middle East to the East Asia, definitely the route is, just going through the Malacca Strait and the South China Sea. So maritime security issue is one of the key issue actually for the whole country. So definitely cooperation, not only just maritime security issue. We definitely want to reduce the heavy dependence on the China. That does not necessarily mean that we want to just escape from all this partnership with the China. But the thing is, the dependency, the level was too high, and in terms of risk management, we need to diversify, right, our trading partner. So in terms of trading partner as well, Southeast Asia, ASEANs are so important for the South Korea as well. So in many different ways, ASEAN countries have been becoming more and more attractive and, how would you say, again, important partners for the South Korea. But the thing is, as you just mentioned, this is a kind of dilemma for not only probably for South Korea, for any some similar countries too. We definitely want to move on, but at the same time, as I mentioned earlier, we do have all this traditional security related issues as well, which means we don't want to be too, how would you say, offensive from their point of view, right? Or we don't want to stimulate too much North Korea, China, and Russia, because, China, Russia's are literally there, right? Literally there. So if something really happens, they can come down. That's a really, from our history, we do have that kind of trauma. It is not only probably psychological trauma. It can be real possibility. So, Japan's strategic calculation, our strategic calculation cannot be same when we deal with all this continental power. So that is why Korea's position has been much more ambivalent about, more specifically speaking, Quad. But since the new government came in, for example, we joined the IPEF, Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, as the starting member. Or our president, he will go to the NATO summit, right? Next week, right? So I'm very much looking forward to seeing the discussion there. And Prime Minister Kishida, for example, he will go to the NPT discussion, which is going to be held in New York, right, in August. So all these, situations are pretty much now fluid. So we want to be much more flexible, but at the same time, again, that we don't want to, right, go to beyond, right? So that's our kind of very difficult position, which cannot be exactly the same with the Japan-like country. So to be honest with you.
If I know, on the question of security, that's something we keep discussing, that the EU has a big role to play, etc. I think we need to be quite honest. In terms of military security, there is almost no role that the EU and Korea will play. We don't have the capacity to project forces that easily to the region. France can do it because it's very, very limited capacity, and the German president can do it once every 5 years or 3 years. So, we need to be realistic. Yet, it does not mean that in terms of security, we're going to be kind of security providers. We are de facto, that's actually a very strong similarities between EU and European countries and Korea. We actually export a lot of weapons, especially to South Asia. We are huge weapon providers to Southeast Asia, from submarines to aircraft to land weapons, etc. Second, that's the question of how do we define security, but there is a lot we can do in terms of non-traditional security, including training police, training, like domestic security forces, etc. Because if we do not do it, the Chinese will do it. And we've seen in Cambodia, in Laos, in Southern Islands, and with the other deal that China offered recently in the Pacific, that China is willing to play that. That is, let's stop thinking about building bases, military alliances, etc. Because that's the question. The question is, at the end of the day, what matters is political security to many of these countries, and political security can be provided through police and through domestic security forces. And what is happening now is that China is investing massively in that, either in training police or in providing the equipment to de facto implement authoritarian practices. And one of the questions for Korea and for Europe, for Australia and for other countries is not only how do we provide security equipment, not only how do we train sometimes domestic security forces, but how do we make sure this is being done in a democratic? And if we do not do it, China will. And I think that's something we need to think of. And Europe, Korea cannot be labeled. And we are not being labeled by Southeast Asian countries are being too much biased, the same way the Chinese or the Americans are being trained. And that's creates kind of opportunity for us to do much more, because at the end of the day, it's the nexus, I would say, between security and democracy.
In this regard, I would like to bring in human security, forum, right? And where you were mainly focusing on how the EU and also South Korea can provide state security. But when we think of it from bottom-up security, like you mentioned parliamentary cooperation already, but also cooperating with NGOs on the ground in the respective countries, where do you think South Korea and also the EU in this regard have capacity to actually have a voice and an influence in the Indo-Pacific countries? And is that well received by those people?
If I may, very, very brief. There is one area in which we do a lot, South Korea does a lot as well, in which we can do much more in terms of human security, is in terms of prevention, preparedness, response after natural disasters. And that intersection between human security, environmental security, etc. In South Asia, in the Pacific Island, in the Indian Ocean Islands, we already do a lot, we can do much. We have a network of NGOs, a network of development agencies in the region. We have at the EU level, that's something quite new that not many people are aware of, but the EU Center of Excellence for Natural Disasters. We have a new EU database on natural disasters, etc. That's an area in which we can develop. It is mentioned very briefly, the EU Strategic Cooperation in the Indo-Pacific, but that's an area in which we can do much more. And facing climate change and the impact of climate change, we have to de facto prepare and adapt our system to that. So it could be in helping these countries set up crisis management mechanism, can be in making sure we can provide more relief and humanitarian relief in case. That's what happened in Tonga Islands in the Pacific a few weeks ago. And I would say that it can even connect us to North Korea. That's something I've been working on for many years, trying to convince French, the German, the Swedish government to do more on that, in helping North Korea to set up its own crisis management to face natural disasters. That's something they need. They have said it explicitly. Kim Jong-un himself mentioned explicitly. That's something the Europeans could provide. Could it be in partnership with South Korea because they have the experience of living on the same peninsula and on facing the same natural disasters? But I think the cooperation between Europe and South Korea dealing with their own natural disasters, including in North Korea, is something that is politically feasible, not sanctioned, welcomed by North Korea, and could be welcomed by both the EU and North Korea, especially in South Korea, especially when, and it's always important to remind everyone that the 4 NGOs that were before COVID in North Korea present on the country, all of them were Europeans, and all of them were directly and indirectly doing kind of natural disasters preparedness and prevention.
Mm-hmm. Yes, maybe if I can just echo this, absolutely, this is a great idea, and I've always been quite in favor of this within the DPRK as well. But also when it comes to other countries, ASEAN would definitely be one of the areas. And so just since also David McAllister mentioned the Czech EU presidency has Indo-Pacific as one of its priorities, one of the things the Czechs have been trying to do is to actually work more into with the partners on the ground in terms of the human security. We have one NGO, People in Needs, which is very much known in the countries on the ground. Yes, so I think this would be also a good way how Czech Republic could also contribute to these policies at the European level, and of course also in cooperation with South Korea.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, if I may, I'd like to add a few words. I can agree more with Dr. Bunda's that comments. And North Korea, again, the corona pandemic, and as I mentioned earlier, natural disaster is really getting more and more increasingly serious because if you think about their poor infrastructure situations, all this landsliding, drought, all these things just definitely influence over their food productivity. There's all this vicious circle, right? Deforestation, drought, and the landsliding, mm-hmm. and the climate crisis, and the food productivity went down. And because of all these days, again, all this food crisis, together with the strong dollar, stronger dollar, actually, more expensive dollar can negatively affect, the North Korea's situation as well. So human security, that's, I think, really the field in which Europe and South Korea can work together. If North Korea cannot accept our offer, I'd love to, I'd love to suggest again the European, EU, or even more neutral country like Sweden, I don't know, whoever is more trustable from their point of view, or so we want to collaborate with those kind of countries, as again the partner to help our brothers over there who are suffering. I don't usually say this kind of description. I'm actually more like how would you say, I'm a more liberal person. I'm an institutionalist. So I do think, our whole, this society, Republic of Korea, is now pretty much different from DPRK. And I don't think like we are the same people, but still, if we recall all this, old nostalgic, how would you say, rhetoric, they are brothers. We'd love to help them, with any possible ways. So again, we need, I think, wisdom from the European friends.
We are almost reaching the end of our discussion. I would like to, at least add one question on a topic that you mentioned, Professor Lim, and that's the new initiative, this Indo-Pacific economic threat. However, we have a myriad of other cooperations, multilateral, bilateral, that are there, and especially in terms of trade cooperation. Some are speaking of the spaghetti bowl of the Southeast Asia and the Indo-Pacific. But now we have another one. And Korea is sometimes reluctant to participate, for example, in the Quad thing. Sometimes it's very forthcoming, for example, in the IPEF. Well, with this numerous multilateral and unilateral initiatives and Korea's ambivalent approaches to all of these, do you think this diminishes or this may enhance Korea's role to be an active participant in the Indo-Pacific, whatever?
I think South Korea now is really in the middle of transitional period. Again, the South Korea became one of the top 10 biggest, again, economies by GDP size, or in terms of purchasing power parity. Actually, the South Korea's purchasing power is now per capita, of course, is bigger than even Japan. So if you see all this kind of numbers, South Korea really became one of the richest countries in the world, but we still do have many residual legacies or like habits from the developmental state mind. For example, in a tariff, we want to reduce when we deal with all this FTA, or any trading partnership, we focus on the tariff, how cheap it's gonna be, right? So that kind of mercantilistic mindset is still there among the policymakers. But at the same time, now more and more policymakers or policy experts, are, including myself, are talking about we need to be more than that, and we have to think about again the global things or global rules, or knowns, all the things, so-called value. So we have both as of now, I think, but probably more and more, how would you say, momentum, I think, can be created toward that direction. So having said that, Quad is actually, different from the IPEF. But this government, of course, as I mentioned, they are more interested in and they are more willing to join in all this rule-making procedure, which is actually, I think, a good thing. So we'll see. Again, the Quad is pretty much different from IPEF. So that is why probably we are somewhat still ambivalent about the Quad, but still we were okayer with relatively okayer with IPEF or CPTPP. We'll see. That's another interesting probably topic. We can take a look.
Sure. Question from the chat, and that will be our last question for today. There's a discussion obviously going on the US strategy to the Indo-Pacific. And the question is, what would you think that the current US-led Indo-Pacific strategy by President Biden is may lead to some sort of new Cold War, especially when we see that this is maybe a clear distinction of the Biden administration's foreign policy, but actually their discussion of international liberalism. And where is South Korea's role in this?
Maybe if I can start, and then we can have also some concluding remarks. So, I thought that we will get through this event without actually mentioning the US-China competition, but obviously it is the elephant in the room, so we go through this topic. In my view, when it comes to the US strategy on China, actually there is probably more continuity between Biden and Trump administrations than possibly Biden and Obama or Democratic predecessors, despite the fact that even, we just discussed free trade before, even the Obama's policies trying to create transatlantic and trans-Pacific trade partnerships were partly inspired by, countering China's growth. So I think in this regard, it's true that the US Indo-Pacific strategy clearly mentions China as sort of the target of the strategy. And in a way, I think the strategy also says that, creating free, open, resilient, and so on, Indo-Pacific is the way how to counter China. In that regard, I prefer much more the European approach, where the European strategy is much more about cooperation and sort of, putting everything more positively, rather than, saying we have to be engaged in the region to stand up to someone else. But of course, even in the minds of the European policymakers, the tensions with China have been in mind. But anyway, I don't want to take too much time from our dear guests from abroad, so I'm happy to stop here.
Well, actually, from South Korea's point of view, new Cold War is not a happy news. Of course not. Again, we are a trader. We are a trader and a island-like country. We are absolutely not happy with the new Cold War. Who is more happier? The North is actually happier with the division, with that kind of, how would you say, team making situation can be an opportunity for them. So that is one reason, I think, why they keep doing all this, missile test or even nuclear test is, there are many people who are talking about the possibility of the 7th nuclear test. So again, but at the same time, that is why I just kept saying that we are facing, South Korea actually facing the dilemma. We want to be more flexible, be more proactive, or want to contribute more to the global affairs and so on. But as long as all these traditional security concerns are holding our ankles, we also need to think about our survival too. Definitely we need to think about. And the Russia's that invasion really stimulated us too. Japan, absolutely. Taiwan, absolutely. So, it gave us a huge warning. This can be happening even in the 21st century, 21st century, 2022, right? When we launch a space rocket to the space, still these kind of things can happen. And if so, are we really ready to deter the threats from the North or whatever those conventional were? So again, we are in a very difficult position, even though we became richer, we became much more influential. So that's again the real dilemma we face. So that is why I also do support the idea we need to build a more partnership with the European countries or with other regional countries like ASEAN or even African countries too. Again, that does not necessarily mean that we want to be against, against China. We want to be against Russia. So that might be my comments to that question.
We won't be able to escape the China-US rivalry and the China-US competition. And in a way, these two countries will force us more and more to pick a side and to believe that we will remain neutral and equidistant in the fantasy. Korea and most of the countries are US aligned. And at the end of the day, we will, and not only military alliance, but also because of the convergence of the political system. At the end of the day, we will converge much more toward the US than toward China. So that the first fantasy that we will be forced to choose, we won't completely side with the US, but we will always be close to the US and to China. So then it brings the question is how do we make sure that the leverage that China is using and that China has been using against South Korea, starting 5 years ago when the South Korean government decided to deploy the tanks and China reacted through economic coercion, how do we better face it? And the Europeans have been out there very lazy. When South Korea was targeted, we didn't say anything and we didn't care. When Australia was targeted in an even bigger proportion, we didn't say anything and we didn't care. When Lithuania started to be sanctioned a year ago, mid-2021, initially we didn't, and we started caring because European governments started to sanction. So on that as well, we need to make sure to have more leverages, to build more economic resilience, and that's something we can do with South Korea. But once again, we won't be able to escape the US-China rivalry. No one has an interest in the conflict between the two. But we won't remain neutral, we won't remain equidistant. The same way China in the Russian-Ukraine war is not equidistant and is not de facto neutral. So the key question is not what we expect it to be, but how do we make sure that we have the leverage, we have the tools to be more autonomous, to be more resilient. And once again, that's something we can discuss easily with the Koreans. We cannot do it with the Japanese. We cannot do it with the Australians. It's more complicated than that. And I would say that such a strong convergence between Korea and Europe that there is no reason for us not to speak more about that. One of the reasons is many in Europe do not know Korea well. Many top leaders in Europe do not know Korea well. And we need also the Korean position to be more proactive towards Europe and to be more proactive in a smart way that is not only toward the EU, but also toward the member states. And that has been, and I will conclude that, finish on that. For many, many years, different Korean administrations have been focusing a lot of course, on trade, on many issues that are to, but on many security and hardcore political issues. At the end of the day, that's with the member states. So they need to come more to Berlin, they need to come more to Paris, they need to make sure that capital cities in Europe agree, because at the end of the day, they do not negotiate with Brussels, except on trade. You negotiate with the capitals.
Thank you very much for your comments about this. I think the moderator key back to Philippa.
Yes. Well, thank you very much, Florian. And I think that those great, very concluding words, encouraging, in a way more cooperation, more discussions, more contact between Korean leadership and Europe, both at the EU level and, as Joan said, also at the individual member state level. So thank you so much to all the guests. Thank you to Antoine. Thank you to Professor Lim. Thank you to Florian for taking for moderating the last section. Of course, many thanks also to Mr. McAllister, who has already left. And last but not least, thank you very much to everyone who's been watching us, especially to our returning clients, if I may put it this way. Hope you enjoyed the whole series. This was the last edition of the Human Security and Development Forum for this academic year. We will return again in the autumn, so we will definitely hear from us. So thank you very much to everyone here, everyone online, and see you in a few months' time. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.